Hello and a very warm welcome. Edition of October Days for Sustainable Development, and we are going on partnered with EU Green Week, which is happening at the same time. Once again, a warm welcome. My name is Tanya Beckett and I'm a broadcaster for the BBC. Our agenda today is to talk about all aspects of biodiversity, but more particularly the impact of its reduction. There are a wealth of figures out there as to how serious this problem is and its impact. But just to give you a couple, Swiss Re, the insurer, has come out with a report in the last few days saying that 1/5 of the world's countries are at risk of their ecosystems collapsing. And this is not purely a biological, marine or nature problem. It also becomes a financial problem, and a very significant one. The report also says more than half of global GDP depends on high functioning biodiversity. So those are some of the aspects that we're going to be looking at today. During the conference, I should also say we have a graphic designer artist called Carole who will be creating some images for us to track our discussion, and we'll be going to her during the course of the conference so that she can update us on her interpretation of what it is that's being said. You may know that in Japan 10 years ago, some very ambitious but also wide-ranging targets were set concerning this subject. We're going to be looking at how close we are, and I can tell you that we're not at meeting those targets, and also what the pandemic is telling us and what impact it has had on the environment around us and our relationship with nature. Once again, I'd just like to give you a warm welcome on behalf of the European Investment Bank, and to say to you that this is an interactive day. We want to hear from you. So please text us via WhatsApp from your phone. I don't know if you text on WhatsApp, you message on WhatsApp probably. And I'm going to give you a number, which I understand is going to appear at the bottom of your screens. It is +352, which is the country code, 691 287 168. Let me give you that again. It's +352 691 287 168. I'm very much looking forward to this afternoon and to hearing from you about what your questions are. It is a wide-ranging discussion, and I think we're going to cover a very great deal of ground at this very, very difficult time. So let me first introduce you to the Dean of the European Investment Bank Institute, Francisco de Paula Coelho. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Madame la Ministre, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you online today for this special edition of the October Days for Sustainable Development. I say special edition because in the 6 years this unique forum has been organized in Luxembourg. It is the first time it is taking place in this format and with only one panel. Exceptional times call for exceptional measures, and the ongoing pandemic has forced us to reorganize the debate and focus the discussion on one key topic: biodiversity loss and pandemic emergency. Biodiversity loss is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goal 15, Life on Land, of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is devoted to protect, restore and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and stop and reverse land degradation and stop biodiversity loss. Pandemic emergency is not covered by any SDG, but COVID-19, brought from wildlife to mankind, is a stark reminder of what can happen when humans mistreat their environment. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not alone in this planet. We share it with some 9 million species of plants, animals, or fungi. Life is the most unique feature of Earth, and the most extraordinary feature of life is its diversity. This diversity is rapidly diminishing, so rapidly that scientists are talking now about the sixth mass extinction. It is, of course, natural for species to disappear. Dinosaurs roamed the earth long before Homo neanderthalensis, and both of them are now extinct. What is worrying scientists is that species are now disappearing much faster, and that is caused by our activities, our human activities. So what can we do about it? And I will leave this answer to Silvia Rova from Foscari University, who will set the scene, and to the panelists. I can only tell you what my bank, the EIB, and the institute I am in charge of are doing. As the EU's climate bank, we were the first multilateral bank in the world to announce that we will stop financing fossil fuels projects as early as next year. We are aiming to support 1 trillion euros of investments in climate action and environmental sustainability in this critical decade from 2021 to 2030. We will gradually increase the share of our financing dedicated to climate action and environmental sustainability from more than 25% today to 50% of our total operations in 2025. And we are aligning our financing activities with the principles and goals of the Paris Agreement by the end of this year. The EIB invests in nature in several ways. We finance projects and we support new financial players in the fields of climate and nature. We provide loans to other financial institutions who act as intermediaries for smaller projects and companies. We invest in funds that leverage private investor interest in support of nature. Together with the European Commission, we also put in place the Natural Capital Financing Facility, a dedicated instrument to finance biodiversity and nature-based solutions in Europe. We also contribute with our expertise, and EIB experts helped define the EU taxonomy system, which determines if an economic activity is green after examining its impact on water and marine resources, on circular economy, on pollution prevention, or on biodiversity and ecosystems. Now, at the level of the Institute, we organize this debate through the October Days. We also pay attention to sustainability in our programs. We finance research on the environment, and we have just launched the first EIB climate share at the European University Institute in Florence. This year, we also selected biodiversity as the special category for our flagship event, the Social Innovation Tournament, an event that rewards and supports Europe's best social entrepreneurs. The winners this year were a Dutch and a Belgian startups, Sponge and Biomonitoring. Sponge developed a smart material which is temperature sensitive and produces water from air using the natural cycles of night and day. Their first products are water-producing tree protections for restoration projects to help young trees survive their first harsh summers. And biomonitoring uses bees acting as drones to collect billions of environmental samples on large surfaces. It then processes the data to monitor industrial and agricultural pollution, to assess the quality diversity of plants, and to help local communities make target improvement decisions to enhance biodiversity. These are two small examples compared to the mighty financing of the EIB group. But to answer the challenge of saving our planet, I believe that no step is too small. So let's reverse the trend and build a sustainable future together. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Francisco. We now want to hear a little bit more about the pandemic, the impact it's having, and what conclusions we can draw from it. So let me introduce to you the Luxembourgish Minister for the Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development, and her name is Carole Dieschbourg. Welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a special pleasure to be with you today at this October Days for Sustainable Development. And first of all, I would like to thank Luxembourg University and the EIB for the invitation and the organization under these very special circumstances. Thank you also for the topic of this edition, because it's at the heart of what we have to do in the future. 2020 should have been the year of biodiversity with Biodiversity COP, and should have been the year of raising the ambition if it comes to climate, the year of climate action for the fifth anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And today we are experiencing a very new situation related to the coronavirus pandemic. And this is changing radically the way of living, the way of working. So the current pandemic has a big impact on our economies, but also on the daily lives. And it places like a magnifying glass. It shows us the interconnection between human and planetary health. COVID-19 is reminding us in a very impressive manner how vulnerable we are, and that we are depending on a functioning nature, and how far we are away. The vulnerability is shown, and it's like I may call it a wake-up call for us all, because we have to question our priorities, and we did it. First priority is protect those we love and show solidarity. And this is what we've done. And secondly, we are now rethinking what we need as a society in order to guarantee resilience, in order to prevent and to build back better. This pandemic is also showing and demonstrating that we are able to act, together to protect humans, to protect the planet. So let's use this single window of opportunity to accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable and resilient world. According to the report on the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, a historic paradigm shift will be required. So we must join forces in order to meet the expectation of young people during the Biodiversity COP next year, so 21. And we must deliver. And we must create, as politicians, like a Paris moment for biodiversity. So one challenge will be really to strengthen the interface between science, policies, to strengthen the narrative about the benefits of climate protection, the benefits of biodiversity protection for everyone, the benefits that we are saving jobs, that we are being more resilient for the future. Multilateral action will be needed and will be strengthened. Nature does not know borders, so we know that migrating birds need to migrate. We know that water connects us all, and it's only through courageous decisions and actions and a good implementation that we will have success. So we must protect at least 34% of the planet by 2030. We must mainstream biodiversity protection, nature protection, and combating climate crisis in order to maintain our economies. So it's about asking where the priorities are and also rebalancing what we do in order to mitigate the risk of future pandemics. So the design of the recovery measures have to be coherent with ambitious climate and environmental target. So there will be lots of money spent during the next year in order to recover. So the utmost opportunity is now to join forces. So I see that we are facing big challenges, but I'm convinced we can turn those challenges in opportunities if we are able to create green recovery, and if we are able to make paradigm shifts toward long-lasting sustainable solution instead of short-term economic interest. We need to shift to an economy that serves people, that serves the environment, rather to just pursuing conventional economical growth and narrow-defined indicators like gross domestic products. It's about chances, but it's also about being clear about where do we invest, how do we do this, and how do we scale up money in order to create this new world. So we need to shift to a well-being economy in order to successfully recover. And I think that Sustainable Development Goals, they give us a really good framework. The Paris Agreement we need to be coherent with the Paris Agreement, with the 5-year cycle and scaling up the ambition. And if we manage to be coherent, and if we manage to mainstream those ideas, I'm convinced that future generations will profit from a more resilient world. And with this, I would thank you for the attention.
Carole, thank you very much indeed for some very strong words there. And I think we're going to hear more of that as the afternoon progresses. During the pandemic, a lot of coverage has been made by the press and elsewhere of Venice and how it has changed many aspects of Venice, but particularly the water. I'd like now to go to our keynote speaker, Silvia Rova. She is, of course, a PhD in Science and Management of Climate Change. She is a researcher at the Foscari University of Venice and is a marine biologist by training. She will tell us about some of this and also be joining us in a panel later to give us more of her views. Silvia, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
So thank you, Tanya, for introducing me. Thanks to the EIB Institute and all the organizers for inviting me to talk to this prestigious event. So here we go. We are standing at a crossroads. Let's try to see this pandemic as an opportunity to change. So I would like to start from what happened in Venice and its lagoon during the lockdown. So basically we started the national lockdown in Italy on the 10th of March and it lasted until the 3rd of May. And during those months we basically had to stay home. Many economic activities were closed and we had to take care of each other and our families and working from home for those who could do that. And things out of our windows changed a bit. So that's the reason why we as a research group decided to start collecting reflections and perspective from the citizens during these very hard times of emergency. So we set up a questionnaire which we entitled "Let's Share Our Feelings, Not to Fall into the Same Mistakes." And this is basically a set of open-ended questions that aim at triggering reflections on the very particular moment we were living at that time. And we distribute it as a snowball sampling approach, so we send it out to our contacts and ask them to send it to their contacts and so on and so forth. So actually we couldn't go out and interview people. So with this approach we came up collecting about 300 questionnaires, and mainly they arrived on the second half of March, so on the first part of the lockdown during the end of the winter period. So for now I will be showing with some of the preliminary results of this study, and I have to thank the head of my research group, Fabio Pranovi, my colleague Alice Stocco, and a student of ours, Andrea Bianchi, for allowing me to tell you some preliminary results unpublished. So, the first question we posed is, do you think that the pandemic could be linked with the lifestyle adopted by our society until now? How? So here you can see that basically 80% of the people interviewed responded yes. So they did realize that we're actually one of the causes of the pandemic. And the main causes, and here you see a graph where the length of the bar reflects the number of responses which fall into a certain category. So we had many different open-ended answers, and we came up with some categories, and you see here the number of answering falling into each category. So the first reason, the first way we are linked with the pandemic emergency is the lack of respect, the lack of equilibrium, the lack of contact with nature, and the egoism typical of humans, unfortunately. Then second, it comes the resources overexploitation, so the way we use our ecosystems. Then globalization, consumerism, followed by pollution, overpopulation, urbanization, and then more practical reasons, although very true, such as the proximity with animals as vehicles and the insufficient healthcare. So we as citizens do perceive that we are one of the main causes of this situation. A second question I'm going to show you is, which is the positive image among the many negative ones that you will carry with you after this crisis? So here you can see again is the bar length is the number of answers. You can see that the first positive image that people brought with them is the environmental recovery. So we could actually look out of our window, although we were forced to stay home, we could still look outside and perceive what was happening. And we could realize that the ecosystem was changing, both from what the news were saying elsewhere, but also right under our windows, so it was perceivable. And that was the main thing, the main positive thing that people perceived during that hard times, followed by other crucial things which mainly reflect our non-material values, though we often forget in our everyday life, but we came again on top as positive things during the pandemic's time, during the lockdown, such as solidarity, silence, slowing down our hectic lifestyle. Silence and nature in Venice, we can actually be reconnected with the first one, with environmental recovery. Then family, the opportunity to make a change. So realizing that the very crucial moment we are living is also an opportunity. Then people resilience when facing a crisis, and then finally some practical things such as smart working, advantages of digital technologies. Then we asked, do you think it is possible to learn something from what we are living in these days? And we asked this both individually and collectively. So here you see collectively that basically the main things are the values that came out as positive image. Then we learn, the take-home message is learning to put them in practice, such as solidarity, altruism, cooperation, social responsibility. Then rethinking our society, respecting the environment, so reconnecting to the environmental recovery that we have perceived from our window. A different management of Venice, and then finally the need to improve the healthcare. And then if we go to the individual aspects, you see again many of these non-material values that we want to learn to put in practice as individuals too. And this here also we see that other aspects emerge which are mostly referred to as self-introspection, and such as slowing down, opportunity to reflect and self-reflect, the appreciation of small things and changing life priorities, the importance of family and friends, the importance of everyone's contributions. So individually we learn that we all need each other's contributions, and we cannot face a situation like this one alone. We need everyone's contribution. Then the importance to deal and learning to deal with negative feelings, and then finally realizing the importance of freedom when we lack that actually. So basically putting in practice many of the non-material values that emerged as positive comes here as the main key lesson learned during this time. And then finally the last question I'm going to show you is what will be, in your opinion, the major change after this crisis. So now we'll look into the future. And here we grouped the answers, which were again open-ended answers, into three main categories: positive, no change, and negative. So where positive change refers mainly to improved solidarity, better environment, a change in priority, healthcare, smart working, whereas the negative refers to the effects of the economic crisis, and then also the fear and the uncertainties which are related to our everyday interactions with people, which are strongly affected by the COVID. So in this case, what we see is that if we group together the no change and negative answers, we get kind of a 50-50, a kind of a balance. So between those which think there might be a positive change and those which think there might not be any change or even negative change. So please allow me to sum up what we can learn from these four questions and the answers to these four questions. First, that we as citizens realize that we are the main cause among the main causes of this crisis. And we can also actually identify the crucial reasons of that. Second, that nature and the recovery of nature has been the main positive aspect, the main positive image that people brought with them after this hard time. And what does it mean? Actually, nature is crucial when humans face crisis. There are studies that prove that a beautiful natural view out of a window in hospital significantly improves the recovery of patients. So we have this kind of evidence, and our results, although very preliminary, seems to go exactly in the same direction. That nature, with its recovery and flourishing, was one of the good things that helped us to relieve the stress of these very hard times. Third lesson learned is that we humans, during this very hard time, rediscovered many non-material values. And we learned that we as humans can react in a cohesive way and positively. We do have the capacity to react when we find ourselves in emergency. And then fourth point, less positive than the previous ones, unfortunately, is that while we could be positive in terms of lesson learned, we cannot be as positive when we look into the future. So more or less it seems that we have 50% chance to go on a positive way and 50% chance not to change or even go worse. So it looks like this kind of answer reflects the fact that we are now standing in front of a crossroads, or even using an ecological image, we are standing now at the edge between two basins of attractions. We're right in the middle, and now it's actually up to us which direction we will decide to go. So please allow me to show you a couple of pictures of what we could see here in Venice. These are two of the many pictures we have collected from citizens during that time. And on the left-hand side, you see the San Marcos basin, the water basin in the heart of the city in front of the San Marcos Square. Well, you might be thinking it doesn't look so impressive, but let's look a bit better. What is the anomaly there? What is lacking? It lacks us. It lacks people. There are no boats, there are no waves, there's nobody around except maybe a small vaporetto over there. That's very unusual over here. We never see the San Marcos basin like that. It's usually very crowded of boats and tourist boats, public transport and wherever. And there's always the water is always very moved, lots of waves. We never see like that, maybe just at night or during very foggy days. And while in those days where everybody was staying home, the water became calm. No waves, no boats. And this brought a very visible change also in the transparency of the water. which was especially visible in the inner channels of the city, right under the windows of the people. Where the water became more transparent, we could see much better the fishes, we could see the bottom of the canal, and that's very unusual too. And the reason is that indeed, with lack of water traffic, there was less sedimentary suspension from the bottom, and there were less wastewater flowing into the waters because less tourists. There are no tourists. There were no tourists at the time. So that resulted in a together with some natural reasons, such as the season. We were at the end of winter, so low primary production, which also contributes to more transparent water, so that we had that phenomena. It was a transient phenomena. Like few weeks later, when spring was coming, also during the lockdown, but spring was coming, there were windy days where the wind were resuspending sediments from the bottom, so we had again less transparent water. So, but people knew that it was transient, but did nevertheless appreciate this feeling, because that's kind of a symbolic of how much pressure we are putting in the system, so how much we are changing it, and how fast the system can behave differently as soon as we stop our pressures. Now on the right, instead, you see that's the water bus stop of Piazzale Roma, and it's maybe not so easy to see them, but there are some eggs over there. There are duck eggs, mallards. And the thing is that bus stop is the bus stop of Piazzale Roma, which is the bus stop in Venice, and it's a kind of hotspot, a hub where thousands of people are passing every day from the city and to the city. So it's a area with thousands of people passing every day. And in that time there were nobody. And mallards found it comfortable enough to lay their eggs right there. That's surprising. Yes, it is. Indeed it is. But mallards instead are not very surprising on their own. We are used to see them in some quiet corners of the city, but to see them laying eggs over there, that's a symbol again of how much we are exceeding naturally tolerable ranges of human pressures. And it shows that Venice instead is part of an ecosystem. The same ecosystem that made Venice flourish in the past centuries. So these two pictures, and again we have many more, I could go on for a while, but I think it's better to stop. But they are just symbols of what happened during the lockdown that could be interpreted in two very different ways, opposite actually. On the one hand, empty Venice is a spooky Venice, is the symbol of the economic crisis, no tourism, the main economic engine of the city. On the other hand, every flourishing ecosystem is a positive from an ecological point of view. It shows that as soon as we eliminate our excessive environmental pressure, the system shows immediately some signs of resilience. And the city and its citizens kind of regain their connection with the ecosystem. And they feel better in that situation, although in a very hard time of crisis. So, how to maintain, at least partially, these positive effects while not blocking completely our economy? Well, that's a challenge, and of course I don't have an answers to that. But what I can say, and that goes in the direction of what we actually work on as a research group over here, what I can say is that what we need is a systemic view. We need a view that puts on the table at the same level, with the same importance, the functioning of the ecosystem and our economic system, the uses we make of the ecosystem. And this approach actually is already well known and is called ecosystem services, or even better, nature's contributions to people, which are the contributions that nature, the ecosystem, and their functioning give to humans, give to our well-being. And what we do over here is that trying to study, map, quantify, analyze, model the very diverse ways in which the ecosystem contributes to our well-being. And these different ways range from the capacity to sequester CO2 to the capacity to purify the waters, to prevent or mitigate erosion of sediments, until more tangible benefits such as the fish and seafood we obtain from the ecosystem, until more cultural aspects, the so-called cultural ecosystem services, which mainly refers to the opportunity for recreational activities, tourism around the lagoon, ecotourism, but also navigation, the traditional activities such as Venetian rowing, and so on and so forth. So what we do as a research group is quantifying all of these different kinds of contribution, and actually there would be even many more, so which we cannot take into consideration for now. And we try to see how they are distributed in space and how they might evolve over time under different scenarios. And what we see is that the crucial thing is the balance that we can have between these different activities and services. So the message is where we can manage to have many of them occurring at the same time, we see that the trajectory of the future is more sustainable. So we can actually leave this same contribution for the future. Whereas where we have an unbalanced pattern towards some activities and uses that have some side effects, some externalities, and that's where the map over there has darker colors, then in those cases we see that the evolution, the trajectories for the future are less sustainable. So we cannot leave for our future generations the same benefits we're getting now. So it's clear that we have to act and change this, unless we want to leave a bad legacy for our children, right? So now allow me to move on to a global scale, which is actually the focus of this day, of this conference. So I will start from the WHO dashboards for the COVID disease. And here, this is an image updated to 3-4 days ago, 19th October, and we see that we have about nearly 40 million of confirmed cases and over 1 million of deaths globally. And the map is very clear in showing that basically every corner of the world has been affected by this disease. So it's a disease that actually had a very quick outbreak and had very strong and hard consequences, especially for the lifestyle and the economy of developed countries, but not only, of course. So it changed our way of living. But we can also move a step back and see how we got there, how we got to this point. If we move back to the 2016, so 4 years ago, the UN Environmental Programme released the Frontiers report, where zoonoses, so diseases like COVID, were flagged as an emergent issue of concern at a global scale. And that was clearly linked with the health of the ecosystem. So what is the message? We knew that this was possibly one of the many consequences of our pathway of development. So please allow me just to go through some of the causes, some of the things that we are producing in our planet and allow me to remind that this is the only planet that we have, and see how this change, how our behavior is changing the planet. I'm not pretending to be exhaustive. There are thousands of things to say on this regards. I will just pick some crucial points out of some globally renewed and relevant reports, such as the IPBES Global Assessment Report, which was released last year, and of which we have the luck and the honor to have here at this conference one of the co-chair, Joseph Settele, and then the IPCC Global Assessment, the 5th Assessment Report, which gives the state-of-the-art view on the climate system and our effects on the climate system. So let's start from the climate. Let's start from our emissions. We are emitting greenhouse gases at an unprecedented rate. Here you see the graph of the CO2 emissions over on the past 150 years. And you see how steep is the increase of the curve in the past 70 years. And if you look on the right, you see the cumulative CO2 emissions. They reached in 2011 about 2,000 gigatons of CO2. Okay, that's a lot. The point is that if you look at the bar on the left and you compare it with the one on the right, you see that about half of this cumulative amount of CO2, so the overall amount of CO2 that we have emitted until that time, has been emitted since 1970. So in about 40 years. So we're not actually doing very well in the past time. And if we look at the time graph on the left, we see that the first 10 years of this century are those in which emissions are actually even faster than before. So we are emitting now at an unprecedented rate. We're not doing very well. And this doesn't even take into account the other greenhouse gases. It's just CO2, but then of course we know we have others such as methane and nitrous oxide, for example. So all these things are having unprecedented effects on our climate system. We are changing the climate already. So IPCC estimates that until now, well, that basically was 2014, the temperature on average has increased by about 0.85 degrees Celsius. So between the 1880 and the 2012. And that has effect also on the oceans, with a relative sea level rise of nearly 20 centimeters in about one century. But that's not the only thing. We are changing the land use of our planet dramatically, to the point that 75% of the total land surface of the planet and about 40% of the ocean area are estimated to be severely altered. And this results in an increasing fragmentation of the remaining natural areas. So nature is scattered more and more. And if we look at forests, although we're doing lots of efforts to preserve them, the forest area continues to shrink. Imagine that in the last 20 years, we have lost about 1 million hectares of forests. How much is that? That's about the surface of France and Germany together. And that's primarily due to agricultural expansion, so our food system basically. And then the consequence goes to biodiversity. Look at this guy here. This is Lonesome George. It was the last Pinta giant tortoise in the Galapagos, and it died in 2012. It was the last specimen of his species. And this is just one example of many. And the IPBES Global Assessment Report estimates that on average 25% of species is currently threatened with extinction, which, if we consider an estimate, which is probably an underestimate, of a total amount of species around 8 million, considering the share of insects and other species, they produce an estimate of about 1 million animal and plant species threatened with extinction. Imagine 1 million eyes like that looking at us. Why are we doing that, right? And which consequences does it have for us? Well, this is where the concept of ecosystem services, or even better, nature's contributions to people come into play. And unfortunately, the IPBES assessment quantified that nature's contributions to people are deteriorating worldwide. And the bad news is that most of them are not fully replaceable. So our technology cannot do the same that nature makes for us. In many different ways, imagine protecting us from natural disaster and extreme events. So basically bringing resilience in the face of the effects of climate change, until allowing us to take food out of the ecosystems, timbers, materials, but also the beauty of nature, the opportunity to have recreational activity, a spiritual connection with the ecosystem. All those different things are not clearly replaceable through technology, right? So please allow me to cite a document called The World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. It is a document that has been released in 1992. Yes, 1992, it's almost 30 years ago, right? Undersigned by more than 1,500 scientists, among which many Nobel Prizes, so the leading scientists at that time. And then was sent to government leaders all over the world, which contain a tragic message, basically. And allow me just to cite a few sentences out of that. The earth is finite. Its ability to provide for growing numbers of people is finite, and we are fast approaching many of the earth's limits. So we have a concept here that I think is crucial. It's the concept of limits. We should realize we are just one among the many species on earth. And as such, we do have limits. We are not unlimited as maybe we think to be. There are some studies, such as the well-known planetary boundaries studies, which show very clearly that we have a so-called safe operating space on this planet, according to many different variables that can be used as indicators of our impact on the planet. And unfortunately, those studies show clearly that we are exceeding many of those boundaries. So we are actually out of our safe operating space. So, what does it mean? It means that we are at the same time increasing the probability for tragic and emergency events to happen, such as the pandemic, and reducing our capacity to cope with them, because we are eroding the ecosystem functionality. And so it happens that now we are here in the middle of the pandemic, a pandemic that changed radically our economic system, and now with the second wave we see that it's not something that is going away in a few months, but it's going to stay with us for a while, and forced us to stop and hopefully think. And we have seen that people realized our responsibility as a society. People realized that we have some crucial values that we might bring with us as a future heritage of this tragic situation. People realize that the connection with nature is something that heals our stress. And people realized that we as society can behave and can act in a virtuous way when facing emergency. We all can contribute to change the situation and to improve the situation. And we all need everyone's contribution to face a crisis. So these things should remind us that we have to change, and this can be things can be seen and can be interpreted as a wake-up call. The pandemic should be, as the Secretary General of the UN has said, should be our wake-up call. And allow me to cite a few sentences written by Pope Francis in its last encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, which was signed on the 3rd of October this year. This encyclical letter is about actually the linkage as brother and sister we all have with each other, but also mentions the pandemic and that we should learn something from it. Once this health crisis passes, our worst response would be to plunge even more deeply into feverish consumerism and new form of egoistic self-preservation. It's kind of a pledge for us to learn something. So now we are here. We are standing at a crossroads. We're using again this image, which as ecologists we like very much. We are now at the edge of two basins of attractions. Right at the edge. And it's up to us to decide where we want to go. And it is the moment and the opportunity to make a change if you want to. So is it really an option to go back to our normal behavior, to our business as usual, to what we were doing before? Well, probably not. Probably going back to normality is not an option. The pandemic has already affected our economic and human system very much and will continue to affect it for a while. So, can we think of continuing on our unsustainable pathway? Can we think of continuing to erode our resilience towards future crises? What kind of legacy do we want to leave to our children? Or maybe we can turn this situation into an opportunity. As many leaders have said, this is an opportunity. And we already have actually a way to follow. It's not that we have to invent it right now. We have had plenty of documents in the past decades that give us a path toward sustainable development, or maybe even better, a sustainable lifestyle. We already have them. First of all, the Agenda 2030, so the Sustainable Development Goals. They are there. They give us indicators to measure where we are and where should we go. We just need to enforce them. The challenge now, I think, is to bring the protection of the environment and the attention towards sustainability as a top priority, to bring it on top. Because that's the key for our future. And that's the only thing we should actually use as a guideline for development. And so the challenge now is to make it happen. Not to decide where to go, but to make it happen. And what I think is that maybe, given this very particular moment we're living now, maybe we could use our innate connection with nature, which emerged, for example, from our questionnaires, as a leverage to make a change. So, both at the individual and the societal level, this connection can be a very crucial point for a leverage, for a transformative change. So now it's up to us. It's up to us to bring in ideas and to be ourselves a contagious example. And I think I can leave here space for the discussion. So thank you very much for your attention.
Silvia, thank you very much indeed. I'd like now to go over to Caroline, who is going to show us some of her drawings that she's been doing so far. I think we've got the pandemic kind of changing our perspective, maybe changing direction on the way that we think here and thinking about our lifestyles, but it's very much obviously at the center of what's being said. There we are, full screen. So we need to reverse the trend and build a sustainable future. And how do our lifestyles impact our future? And also showing that nature and resilience, and we need to give it a chance. Nature is resilient and it heals. it heals. And that's an important point there. Technology cannot replace what nature does for us, how true that is. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a very strong economic impact from a shrinking of biodiversity. So we're going to be coming back to Caroline a little bit further in the panel, which I'm going to introduce to you now. So allow me first to introduce our panelists. Joseph Setterle is an agrobiologist and co-chair of the Global Assessment of PBES from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Germany. He is on the bottom left. Hi to you, Joseph. Sharon Brooks is on the bottom right. She's the Deputy Head of Business and Biodiversity at UNEP WCMC and has about 2 decades of experience in the conservation sector. Welcome to you, Sharon, on the right here. Top right is Mauro Randon, who's from the WWF. He will introduce himself probably a bit more fulsomely, and we've already introduced Silvia. So Silvia's introduced this idea about how the pandemic is really a wake-up call and changing our mentality. Joseph, can I come to you first and ask if you would agree with this? Are you optimistic that this will be a change of direction for people, this pandemic, because people will realize that there is a connection between our behavior and our own health and economies?
Well, I'm limited optimistic, let's put it like this. I think there is, it's obvious there is a link to our behavior, but I also have the impression that many people are not yet aware of the kind of link between pandemic and the nature around us. So there's something we still have to, let's say, emphasize in all the discussions, that to make it more aware that ecosystems and their functioning are closely linked to how we, let's say, may experience pandemics in the future.
How would you give an example of that? How would you exemplify that?
What do you mean? Once again.
Well, you said that there is a link, but how could you describe that link to us as you see it?
Yeah, well, I would say, looking for in the terms of diversity. Now we have biodiversity, we have landscape diversity, and we can see many of the problems we have, like the pandemic, but also like agricultural pests, whatever, is dependent on, let's say, the structure we have in the landscape, on the diversity of organisms in the landscape, which means the more monoculture we have, or let's say the more, concentration of certain animals in certain places, the higher is the risk for these pandemics to evolve. Which means you have a higher chance that viruses are kind of, let's say, getting multiplied because they have lots of hosts, and also have a higher chance of spillovers. So I think in general, going into a direction of land use and forest conservation, which keeps diversity on the species, but also on the structural level, is surely a very good, let's say, precautionary method to avoid too many future pandemics.
Joseph, thank you very much. Sharon, can I come to you next and ask what you think the pandemic has done to change our mentality or our understanding about our relationship with reducing biodiversity?
Thank you, Tanya. I think, as it's already been quite well articulated, it's really that recognition, I suppose, of the real consequences of our relationship. So I think what we've had this sort of wealth of knowledge for many years about biodiversity loss. We're seeing the kind of accelerating effect as biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation is continuing and reaching many tipping points. There's been this sort of rising up the agenda of understanding how that then manifests as risks to us as people, to humanity, to society, to economies. And I think what this pandemic has really shown us is that it's not a sort of gradual long-term change, something that for the next generation to worry about, but these dramatic events are going to take place and I think it was this notion of a sort of wake-up call, or what Inga Anderson, I think, phrased as a sort of warning shot from nature, that actually these events can happen that can totally floor our economy, our society, our human health. So I think what it's made those risks, which were sort of fairly long-term or were rising up the agenda, they've suddenly become very stark, I think, and very real to people all over, because nobody has been immune to this. And I think that the loss of biodiversity and the risk associated with that was always very much felt a little bit far off for many people, a bit far away, the other side of the world, perhaps, where many of the problems, particularly in terms of from the consumer side down to where many of the biodiversity is being lost was being felt. It's often felt quite far away because it's sort of a global problem. So I think it's just made it very stark and very real that it's going to affect each and every one of us, not in tomorrow's day, but actually here and today where we are now.
Thank you very much. Silvia, I'll come to you in a moment, but Mauro, if I can come to you first. Again, this link between the pandemic and our behaviour, or perhaps what we should have learned from the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya, and good afternoon to all. I think everyone has mentioned some really good points, all the speakers before me. Well, the first thing is the connection between the pandemic and the sort of human health, and basically how the biodiversity and how the link between the zoonotic diseases are due to the human beings and basically the impact that human beings had on biodiversity in the past few years. So we have recognized that these key drivers for the emergence of the diseases are land use change, expansion of agriculture, and animal production, and this is basically finally in our face. I think one point that was mentioned before, we've realized that biodiversity is an issue, and before it wasn't the same as climate change, for instance. We saw the consequences of climate change and we started experiencing them, but we didn't yet for biodiversity, and it became very real, I think, with the pandemic, and people realized how much nature has come back. For instance, Silvia has made some really good examples. I think the point is that the numbers are worrying. So we're losing biodiversity at a staggering rate, and so we started realizing if we keep going this way, we are increasing the probability for a new global pandemic happening with massive consequences for human health and economics. I think the link also to the vulnerability was also very important. That was mentioned before. So essentially, we are realizing that our economies and our societies are extremely vulnerable. So the potential impact that biodiversity loss could have on our society are going to be massive, but nothing compared to what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic. Loss of biodiversity can compromise agricultural production, and this could have incredible consequences for food security all around the world, and particularly for the most vulnerable populations. So that's the key point. It kind of reminded us that we are all connected. Health, economies, natural environment, we're all interlinked. And sort of tackling problems in silos is no longer an option. We must create solutions that can respond to these connections, and we need those solutions now. We cannot wait for long.
Yes, if I could come to you, Silvia, how's your mic sounding? Would you give us a few words to see if your mic is sounding better?
I hope it works a bit better now. It didn't do much actually, but you can hear me properly.
We'll come back to it in a second. Joseph, just to come into you, what do you see as the key reasons that we are reducing biodiversity? What specifically is it that we are doing that causes the range of species to reduce at the pace that it is reducing, that Silvia has highlighted?
Well, we could approach this with different ways. So first, let's say we have this, what we called in the global assessment, direct drivers. So far, it's mainly the change of land use and sea use, which affects a lot of biota, terrestrial, and marine. Then we have the direct exploitation, which is forest cut down, for example, or fisheries. Then we have climate change. Already at the moment, it's number 3 in the top, let's say, drivers, direct drivers, followed then by pollution and invasive species. That was the analysis we did in the global assessment. But by and large, these things all refer back to the indirect drivers. So it's all about the society, about how we develop technology, how is our social system, how we run the economy, this kind of thing. So it's all has to do with how humans act to nature. And I guess this short-sighted and, let's say, small perspective we have in time and space created a lot of these difficulties, especially in relation to the land use factor. So I think combating land use in terms of going down from the monoculture large-scale thing to smaller ones, as well as combating climate change, for example, are surely two main aspects we have to deal with our, let's say, future economic development.
So land use and climate change being two of the top reasons there. Silvia, can I come to you and ask, what would you say the key cause is of us reducing biodiversity? How are we causing this damage?
Well, I think that's already been said. Indeed, we can think of these global issues, but we can also think of our everyday life. So, I mean, I'm not saying that we can change biodiversity trends by behaving responsibly every day, but we can, with our behavior, have an impact on the major drivers, direct drivers that Joseph just mentioned. So, for example, choosing to consume local goods and coming from small agricultural farms instead of going to the supermarket and buy independently of where goods come from. That's just a very simple, stupid example. But I mean, things like this make a change, even at the individual. So I'm not. I mean, that's the way each of us could contribute. Thinking of reuse and recycle paradigm, right? So don't changing our.
Okay, Silvia, I think your sound is breaking up again a little bit, if you wouldn't mind me interrupting you there. I think the microphone is here, and I'm wondering every time you turn away from the microphone that we can't hear it. So if you just move it so it's closer to where you're talking. Yeah. Let's see if that works. Yes, please continue.
Does it work now?
Yeah.
Okay, so all right, thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm saying is that even our small actions can have an impact on a global scale if we all start behaving differently. That's why I think we need a transformative change, not only at the institutional level, but also at the individual level. So working on education, that's the first thing. Working on gender equality that allows to have different population trajectories, because one of the indirect drivers that drive these trajectories that we have now is the excessive population. Excessive population can be stopped, so to say. The growth can be reduced if we give women access to education. So you see, as much as we break the problem into its smaller causes, we get back to our everyday behavior. So give women the chance to have education. Give our children the chance to educate and to educate in connection with nature.
Silvia, I think your sound is breaking up again, so we're going to come back to you in a second. I apologise to interrupt. Sharon, if I can come to you. Silvia, talking about gender equality there, what would you see, Sharon, as some of the things that we can do that would have some effect that we're already onto? I mean, we're already onto gender equality. So some low-hanging fruit, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, there are a whole array of solutions that are out there. I mean, I think that this is the good news, is that we're not started. It's not that, yes, this has become very apparent now to everyone, but there's a whole wealth of knowledge out there on what we can actually do to address the biodiversity crisis. So there are a whole, as highlighted already through the IPBES assessment and the previous speaker talking about those indirect drivers. But what it really, I think the point that I would like to make on that is that, progress is being made, solutions are there. We're seeing, and my position, I suppose, I work much more on this with the finance and business community, and what we're seeing is that there has been a great deal of progress being made in terms of different ways of understanding their impacts. How can you assess the impacts of your activities on biodiversity? How can they be addressed? What are the tools that you can use? But what we're missing, I suppose, is that transformative effect, and that's what we're really looking for in this space. So what we're seeing is quite a lot happening in a voluntary through voluntary mechanisms, but we need to the whole food system needs to change. As been mentioned, land use change is one of the big challenges that we face. How can we actually overhaul our entire food system, our energy system, dealing with our patterns of consumption and production? So I think it's less about, I think we've got the toolbox of what are the solutions that are there. How can we empower people? How can we educate people? How can businesses move forward? But at the moment, it requires quite a lot of, it requires businesses to be forward thinking. It requires them to be quite sophisticated. It requires them to potentially compete in an unlevel playing field where they might be penalized because the rewards and the incentives are not in the right place. So I think what we're needing to, the toolbox is there. And what I'm hopeful is, and I suppose encouraged by what we're seeing at the moment, is that the momentum that is building and the will that is building by political leaders and leading companies and financiers. We heard earlier about the policy shifts that within the EU and what the European Investment Bank are doing. And these are the kind of shifts that we need to kind of turn the ship around. And I think if the will is there, we have got that sort of toolbox ready, because people have been working on a whole array of different solutions. I think, one of the other big challenges, as other people have sort of highlighted, is this. It's really demonstrated how connected our societies are, and global trade is clearly one of the big challenges that we have, in that what we eat here has massive impacts in another part of the world. And the transparency around the supply chains of food and so on is one of the big challenges that we face. But there are huge strides being made to address transparency. We now have tools where we can actually watch near real-time satellite imagery and see where deforestation is happening. We have trade models that can connect what's being consumed in one country to where it's being grown in another country. So there are many mechanisms in place, and I think if we can change the structures in which businesses and financiers and all of us operate, then it will be possible to turn the tide, essentially.
Maro, thank you very much indeed. Let me come to you and ask. I mentioned at the very beginning when I was introducing this conference about these targets that were set 10 years ago in Japan. And I don't want to pin you down on those targets, but I do have an alarming list of them here and why biodiversity is so important. But we're missing targets again and again. Why are we missing targets? Why is it that biodiversity has almost not been at the center of what we're trying to achieve, do you think?
Yeah, actually, we're very far from reaching these targets. Particularly the SDGs recent reports have shown that COVID-19 is going to cause this is the opportunity, however, the SDGs are now more relevant than ever. So they provide these answers to some of the questions that were raised right now. So the idea, and I think from what we hear from many leaders globally, is to really introduce some big decisions for the next 10 years and to accelerate and bring these processes to the appropriate speed. Somebody mentioned earlier that 2020 was meant to be the super year. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. This doesn't have to be an excuse. Our fear is that COVID-19 becomes an excuse to not prioritize these targets anymore and to not dedicate sufficient attention. But I think things are changing also in other ways beyond the targets. There are new treaties being negotiated right now. For example, the treaty on areas beyond national jurisdiction. So areas that haven't been managed in the past, and they were really no man's land, and they could everyone could really take advantage. Now they're really thinking about how to manage these areas sustainably through marine planning. So things are in progress, and I would be positive about what's happening. And to conclude, I think somebody mentioned before about the changes that are needed. I think one of them is this massive shift in finance. So the way that sustainable finance needs to come into the picture, and we're seeing it with, for example, the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance, which is essentially defining what financially sustainable and environmentally and climate sustainable investment is. These are the sort of things that can really make a difference.
Yes, Sharon was talking about that earlier, and I'm going to ask you, Sharon, again about that a bit later on. I asked the panelists to send us some pictures, and we have some of those, biodiversity being a very picture-rich area. So we're going to show some of those in a moment, but let's go back first to what Caroline has been drawing for us. I wonder if we could bring that full screen. Maybe it's my need for glasses, which is the problem here. Here we go. So global economies, and we do have a toolbox. And this is what Sharon was talking. This is the word that she used earlier. And I think that's a very interesting thought, that we do have the toolbox, but we need to learn to use this. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are they being met, any of these targets, and taken seriously? And then on the left-hand side, everything is connected. So biodiversity is not a problem that is a standalone problem. It's actually part of the climate changes and the climate difficulties and sustainability difficulties that we are facing. And she's still going. Look at her. She's still going. Josef, can I come back to you for a moment and ask you this? I know that German farming is a very sophisticated area, because I've done some work on German sustainable farming, would you believe? But this question about how we use land is very important, isn't it? And one would imagine that if we were using intensive farming, that might be more of a problem. But on the other hand, we're using that way less land. So how do we balance our needs to feed ourselves and our needs not to encroach upon nature? Or do we simply need to change our consumer habits? Is there only one answer?
There might be different answers, but I think I would always like to look at it in a combination of local and international and global factors. So I would say farming is at the moment very sophisticated. That's right. It's also highly intensive, but it depends on how you define intensity, of course. I would say if we succeed in, for example, moving towards a less meat-biased food, we can afford lower stocking densities of cattle. Cattle is an important component, also sheep, of course, for many of our semi-natural grasslands, for example, which are known to be very species-rich. So if you can maintain them on the low density, you have a kind of high-quality steak, whatever you like. So if the steak is nearly as expensive as your grilling device, I think you have made very good progress. At the moment, it's you have a high sophisticated equipment and very cheap meat on it, so that doesn't fit together. If we don't produce this high amount of meat, it's also much better in terms of international trade. So we don't need, for example, the standard example is soy imports. We don't need soy from South America, which causes a lot of problem in the rainforest. So actually, the moment we are exporting extinction in terms of species, so species get lost mainly not in Europe, but outside Europe, because you have other constellations here. But in Europe, you have the risk of losing the diversity within species, so the genetic diversity, which also is one important component of diversity. So genetic diversity, species, and ecosystems, that's a kind of definition we normally use. So reducing the intensity of land use, having high quality food combined with a changed consumption pattern would, I think, be a way to move. And at the moment, I see the decision of the GAP yesterday in Brussels doesn't really, let's say, make me too optimistic at the moment, because we are moving in the right direction, but not at the right speed. So this kind of eco parts in the whole food chain are still, I would say, underdeveloped. There's a lot of space which can still be improved. And I think the European, let's say, population at least, is very supportive of having new ways of, let's say, land use and agriculture. Of course, behavior is still a problem in terms of what people buy in the market, either on the market or in the supermarket, and how informed they are on this and how willing they are to also pay a bit more for things which might be higher quality.
Thank you very much. Let's come to you, Silvia, and ask, nowhere is consumer behavior more of a concern than in Venice, perhaps. That's probably an exaggeration to say nowhere, but it is a very big concern, consumers in Venice. So how do you think, if you were to urge consumers to change their behavior now and pick up the lesson that we have learned from the pandemic, what would you say to consumers?
To consumers, to say I had some issues with the audio. I'm sorry. So what I would suggest here in Venice is to focus on the production that is around here. I'm not sure I'm answering correctly to your question because I have really issues in hearing you, but what I would suggest is to look at what is produced here. Try to lower the distance between the producer and the consumer, and try to avoid. I'm really thinking about the very simple things. So avoid eating tomatoes in December. Try to eat the food that is produced in this season from local producers, and we will start to decrease the chain. We will decrease the transportation emissions for bringing food here from far away. We will give incentives to local producers to produce more and to produce sustainably. If we take care of how things are produced, go for biological food, organic food. Sorry, mistranslation from Italian, and things like this. And I'm not sure I've answered correctly, but that's my suggestion.
Silvia, thank you very much indeed. So don't buy tomatoes in December was an illustration, a very strong illustration, I think, of some of the problems that we're getting to. Mauro, you have some photographs that you have sent us. So I'd like to take a look at those now, if we can. So if we can put this first one up. So we've got some cars here and on the left-hand side, a forest. What is this telling us, this photograph, Mauro?
Yeah, the photographs I sent you, they were illustrating, I think, a lot of points that were raised during this conversation. So, and that Silvia included in her presentation. This one is obviously the deforestation rate. I think the numbers have already been mentioned. The rate is incredible. Essentially, the more we reduce forests and mostly for livestock production, that's the problem number one. The more we bring the population and the population living closer to wildlife, that then can affect us in creating issues of health risks like the pandemic. And that the other infographic that I sent you summarizes this connection. I don't know whether you will be able to.
Okay, let's take a look at the next image if we can. Where is that photograph taken, did you say, the first one?
It's Brazil, and this one is the Great Barrier Reef, and it's just another example that we often, when we talk about pandemics, we talk about deforestation, but we have other global ecosystems that are being subject to massive reduction. The Great Barrier Reef has been suffering a reduction of 50%. These recent reports have shown due to coral bleaching. So we need to focus on the full picture. Very often we forget about the sea, but the sea is also a big priority.
Silvia, if I can come to you again and ask about this encroachment of the seas. We don't necessarily think so much about that, do we? We think about land, maybe, and we probably think about coral, but that's probably where it ends. But I think it's true to say that we are trying to, from an economic perspective, make better use of the ocean. Is that a threat? Is that a threat to biodiversity?
Well, for sure. I mean, for example, in general, we are overexploiting the fish stock at an alarming rate. And although there have been several efforts to bring fisheries to a more sustainable level, towards the so-called maximum sustainable yield, the amount of fish that can be captured, we still have that about 75% of the fish stock are either overexploited or threatened. So, I mean, that's an issue, and that's only fishing. And then in the marine space, we have the presence simultaneous presence of different kind of uses and threats, such as navigation, extraction of oil and gas, uses for touristic reasons, then the installation of infrastructures on the coast. So we have several types of uses of the coastal and marine system that interact with each other and need to be somehow conciliated with each other through the so-called marine spatial planning. So that's another big issue of concern, that another big field of study which needs more attention, because, as I said, almost 40% of ocean area has also been severely affected by our activities. So that's not only land, that's the sea, and we need to take care of that as well, of course.
Okay, Sharon, I want to change tack a little bit and come back to you. I know that you're much more connected to the impact in the finance community and so on. And I made the point at the very beginning that this is an economic issue too. So the first thing, I know that there is an area of finance that we're increasingly aware of, which puts metrics across sustainability. So, for example, how companies perform, and they try to put a metric across how the impact on the environment and so on. And chiefly, this is an area of investment. Does biodiversity, to your knowledge, does it feature within that very prominently or not?
The truthful answer is not yet. It's coming, I hope. There has been, within certain institutions, I think, a lot of progress made on this. So one of the things, so as in terms of sort of improving the way this ESG incorporates nature-related issues. So there has been a lot of work done, and certain institutions are certainly leading in that space. And how do we get biodiversity impacts incorporated? It's very challenging. I mean, one of the issues when it comes to understanding from the perspective of the finance community is that the impacts on biodiversity are very location specific, which is very different to how when looking at climate change. And it wasn't easy to arrive at the where we've got to with climate change either, but it's a much simpler way to measure it and to measure the contribution you're making towards mitigating it. When it comes to biodiversity, in order to do that, you need to have good visibility of where your investment flows are going and what are the impacts of those operations, those activities on biodiversity. And as I said, it's very location specific, so you need to know what's happening on the ground. When it comes to no matter where you might be financing along supply chains, the biggest impact on biodiversity is often at the production site. And being able to have that sort of transparency, that traceability, that visibility is what's very challenging. So there's been quite a lot of movement in trying. I think what's really encouraging is that what we're now seeing is that there is a big conversation happening about materiality. So it's no longer we need to conserve nature for nature's sake. We're dealing with nature-related risks because they are material, and there is a growing understanding that the materiality of those, in terms of if you're providing finance to an operation that may maybe if it's an agricultural production, will the yields be affected? Will that be a risk in terms of the credit and repayment risk? Will it create reputational issues? Will it create legal liabilities, regulatory issues? There's a whole array of different actual risks that are financially material. At the moment, a lot of those are very hidden. I think as transparency grows and we start to understand where the impacts are, there's much more oversight of knowing that soy that may be produced in the Cerrado of Brazil that's causing land conversion, that's being sold to this company over here, that's being financed by this company here. That kind of traceability, that transparency is growing. And I think the leading institutions are trying to get ahead of that curve and really understand their portfolios. Where are their investments going? And can they engage along with their clients to ensure that certain standards are upheld, and that they can get that visibility to ensure that the impacts are mitigated on the ground. And so that is happening. But as I said, it's still quite early days. I think that the as I said, there's quite a body of knowledge now there, but it does require quite a lot of investment from the business community, from the finance community. And one of the problems, I guess, is that a lot of the costs of sustainability are kind of borne by the producers. And what we need that investment to come so that they can have that visibility to be able to then understand, how do I de-risk my portfolio? If you're investing, it's not just agriculture. If it's a hydro dam, for example, that maybe become unviable because of the erosion from the deforestation, sedimentation of the rivers, and so all these businesses can be at risk, and the financial institutions that are behind them are then exposed to that risk. So I think it's coming. One of the challenges, and what there's an awful lot of work at the moment in line with the global agenda to set new targets for biodiversity. There is also a lot of effort going on within the corporate world, within the financial world, around how they can set targets, how they can, what metrics to use. How do you measure your performance regarding biodiversity? And that's a big, big question at the moment, because we don't have one metric. We can't just have a ton of carbon released. Biodiversity is many different things. And I don't believe we will ever have a metric, but hopefully we will get to a point that we have agreement over the core metrics that you can use to understand impact, to measure impact, report impact, to disclose it and set targets. So I think it's coming, and hopefully the sort of new momentum with what is the kind of postponed 2020 super year, yet still a very important year, will help with that.
Because I've got some messages coming through on WhatsApp, so I'm going to come to those in a moment. Mauro, if I can come to you and just ask, before I get to those messages, we've talked about, and I just want to emphasize this because I think we have talked about it before, but when you use more land, you are encroaching on the habitat of wildlife. That we understand why we might reduce biodiversity in that way. But Sharon mentioned something else, and this is soil erosion and so on, and other means. So could you just give us 3 or 4 means, if that come to the top of your head, as to how it is that we cause a reduction in biodiversity?
The ways we cause the reduction of biodiversity. Well, there's a lot of ways in which we cause the reduction of biodiversity. First, definitely the decrease in topsoil. So, as you're mentioning, is one of the global issues. Definitely, the pollution is another. It's another issue. Climate change itself causes a reduction of biodiversity. The introduction of alien species. Humans are responsible for moving species. This is quite common in oceans, in the shipping sector, with ships through ballast water, bringing species to other parts of the world, and these species becoming invasive and therefore causing a reduction of local indigenous species. So there is a unfortunately, there are a lot of ways in which we have impacts. These, I think I mentioned already more than 3.
Thank you very much indeed. You hit your target there, which is rather more than we're doing in the rest of this contact. Silvia, there's a question coming in from Ingmar Schumacher, and one of them is, buying locally and organically is very good, but we can't feed the world on this. It requires too much space. Highly industrialized food production requires much less land and thus preserves biodiversity. Is this the case?
Well, it is the case from some point of view. We cannot actually, we need some intensive, but we don't need everything to be intensive. So we need to find a mix of the 2 things. And also in the intensive agriculture, we need to have some kind of attention towards, for example, building some buffer areas around the agricultural fields. Also in terms of intensive agriculture, there can be practices that reduce significantly the impact that this agriculture has. So, I mean, the more we move towards organic, the better it is, especially where we do have instead some space for doing that. But I mean, the important thing I believe is to have also implemented a series of things that reduce the impacts of intensive agriculture. So there's both sides of things that need to be done.
Yusuf, a question coming in, which I think relates to something that you were talking about, is burgers. I think you were saying this, that burgers need to be as expensive as the device that they are cooked on. Was it you who said that? I can't remember. But the point is that, this creates an affordability issue for many people. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I made the statement a bit differently, but it means you just invest lots of money in an expensive equipment, but not anymore on the things you're eating. So you could really save a lot in the equipment. Just have a campfire and make your steak, for example. That was the point I wanted to make. So it's a matter, of course, that's the point. So it's not really that it has to be expensive. The other one has to be much cheaper, and you can save this money for the more important part, which is, I think, the food which you want to eat. That's why you do this kind of barbecues, I guess. That's the reason. So that was the point. What was the question again?
Understood. Let me look at the question. It says that buying locally, organically, where is it? I'm coming to it, I think. Low-income families cannot afford this if products products become unaffordable, if they are too expensive, and organic foods are still considered in some cases rather niche and quite overpriced. It doesn't necessarily mean if we eat organic or well-produced food, carefully produced food, that the price must go up. Will that always be the case?
Still me?
Yeah, Joseph, go ahead. Schieß mal los.
So I would say, well, you always tend to argue in very extreme ways. So as if everybody would have to buy the expensive food or the cheap food. But I guess in reality, you have the whole spectrum. So you have lots of people who may be able to afford this, then they should do it. Others maybe not. That's the same with the issue of, let's say, land use and organic versus conventional production. I think if we are at a stage where we say everything is organic, okay, that would be very far-fetched. But at the moment, we should at least move in a direction where we have still lots of, let's say, possibilities, and we can see how far we can get. It's also a matter of which kind of products you produce. So it's a matter of quantity and of quality and of which kind of food you want to eat. So I guess doesn't necessarily mean that organically produced food is more expensive or needs more space. It depends on our consumption pattern in the end. So I guess as long as we have space to maneuver in such a direction, I never discuss the issue of 100% organic or 100% pesticide-free. I just discuss something which moves in this direction.
Sharon, if I can come back to you while we're on the subject of money and economics. You were saying earlier that, we're starting to put metrics across companies in the way that we do for their environmental behavior, and biodiversity being part of environmental, but it's a bit late to the party. I started off by saying that there was a link between biodiversity and us supporting our economies. And in fact, biodiversity was not just something nice that we needed to preserve. It's actually necessary. So I don't know if I'm being fair in asking you this question, but in your analysis, is it possible to describe that link between the health of our economies and biodiversity?
Yeah. So I think the problem stems from the fact that we are increasingly aware of what nature provides for us as a service. It provides us with those goods and services, and our dependency on it is there. The problem is we don't pay for it. Nature is considered a free good service. So we have a lot of work to understand how do we account for it, how do we estimate the value of what it provides for us. And there's some staggering statistics out there around the contribution that it is making to global GDP, and how much is at risk if we lose it. But at the moment, it doesn't appear on the balance sheet. And I think that and it isn't paid for. So it's one of those externalities that people have been talking about for many years. And I think as things become as those risks become very real, very immediate, then I think things have to change, and hopefully not before it becomes so scarce that it's so incredibly valuable, that before that we actually, reach these tipping points and lose many of those services. I mean, when it comes to, back to the arguments around the sort of organic versus conventional food systems, it really, I think, also just comes down to the longer term view that you have. So some of it might be a cheaper way to produce food, but it's not. But we are degrading our soils. We're losing our pollinators through these kind of monoculture methods, through overuse of agrochemicals. We are the runoff into our oceans, which is affecting our fisheries. So it's a very stifled view to think of that in terms of that is a better way to feed the world. What we need to move is into these sustainable food systems. They need to become mainstream, so it doesn't become a niche market that only those that can afford to shop guilt-free can do so. It needs to become something, a better way of producing food. When you look at things like food production, one of the staggering atrocities is the level of waste that we have in food. So, there are many ways that we can address the food system in a way that we could keep it affordable. If the incentives are there, one of the problems are many of the perverse subsidies that are in place that overload our croplands and encourage that sort of way of those means of production. So I think it does come back to being able to work with nature and understand. So if you produce in a certain way, and then over time you lose those services, what is it going to cost you to replace them? There's many ways of doing that and saying, how can you manually pollinate those crops? Far more expensive than just maintaining nature. So it's just trying to get those decisions, and who is it? But it all comes down to who pays, and how do you, and having a longer term enough vision to be able to ensure that the incentives are right to do the right thing, so that we can produce food and conserve nature, and it doesn't become a one or the other, because it needn't be like that.
Thank you very much. I've had a question coming in saying, is blockchain a viable option when we're monitoring this? I don't know much about blockchain, so I'm slightly perplexed by the question, but we'll come back to it in a second. Maybe you can think of an answer during the time that we are looking at Caroline's latest creation, her picture here. Let's check that full screen and have a look at that. Global economy is at the center there, and Sharon was mentioning earlier on the toolbox. Here at the bottom, we have this balance. And I guess that's kind of what we want to take away, really, isn't it? The idea that we are balancing one thing with another, that actually it's a necessity, and also it's an economic necessity, not simply, or should I say simply, not purely a nature or natural necessity there. So we'll come back to those in a moment. Sharon, does blockchain feature in your world of assessing biodiversity and the impact on biodiversity by corporations?
Well, I confess to being no expert when it comes to these technologies. I think it plays, from what I understand, it certainly has potential for us to understand, to be used in the supply chain context, so that we can improve traceability of the commodities that flow around the world. But I'm certainly no expert in understanding the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts of how blockchain works and exactly what it does.
So you're in good company there. Mauro, can I come to you and just return our thoughts to the pandemic? Silvia has made it very clear that there is a link between our behaviour and the pandemic, our broader behaviour, not very specific necessarily. But I do want to come to the specific. And that is, we think we know where the virus came from. Are there, and there has been a lot of discussion about our close contacts with animals and so on. How seriously is that being taken now, do we think? Because you can have what laws you want, but if they're difficult to enforce, that's a different thing, isn't it? I wondered if you could talk to us about that.
Okay. Can I ask you, Tanya? The connection is really bad. It's really disturbed.
I'm very sorry. I wanted to ask if, going back to the origins of the virus and the very strong suggestion that it came from wet markets, and these are dangerous things to have going on in China or indeed elsewhere in the world. What realistically can be done about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I got it now. Thanks. So essentially, of course, these type of markets are common in many parts of the world. It's very often linked to cultural tradition, so they're very difficult to regulate as well. But it is becoming necessary. I mean, the consequences of the pandemic have demonstrated that this regulation is essential. Very often in these wet markets, you can easily find endangered species, and that simply should not happen, even if the cultural, let's say, pressure to have them is dominating in many places. So yeah, better regulations. There are numerous regulations on the trade of endangered species or species at risk of extinction. Implementation, it's an issue all over the world, also because the economic value of those species is huge. But if we want to be serious about avoiding pandemics and the risks that these markets can bring to the table, we need to make sure that these regulations are implemented, even in those countries where it is more difficult to implement them.
Thank you very much indeed. A very specific question there. So I want to just come to each of you, if you could just give us a final message, really. We're going to wrap up a little early because I can see that technology is not always on our side here. So let me come to you first of all, Joseph. What is your message about how we can address biodiversity and the urgency of it?
Well, I think first of all, it's a matter of how we interact among each other. So I guess dealing respectfully with all the stakeholders is an important component. If you talk to farmers, talk to scientists, or vice versa, it's always important to accept the other people's view. I think we have no chance then solving these things democratically. So really finding, let's say, going along in the same direction in a kind of large unifying march, something like this. So I guess it's about interaction of people. Then it's about, let's say, also bringing across the main roles nature has for everybody. And I think we are on a good track here. The pollination has been mentioned. That's one example which can be much more easily told as a story than, for example, the carbon sequestration. Maybe that's also still okay, but others are more difficult. So using examples which are close to everybody's life, and then in making people, let's say, thinking about what their behavior has, which kind of impact it has. In the end, whomever you talk to, everybody likes nature. So everybody likes to go for a walk, to enjoy nature, to have some recreation out in the wild or in whatever it is in the parks. So I think, these are the important components are those of interaction of people, and this way bringing a bigger movement, which also forces then also decision makers to follow these directions. So I think this is the bottom up part. But also we have to, let's say, engage with politics in order to bring across the messages as well, also for these top-down approaches which sometimes are needed. And I think one important in the context of finances is the problem of tax havens, where lots of money is, let's say, going illegally somewhere, which also has a very bad impact on biodiversity.
Thank you very much indeed. If I can come to you then, Silvia, next. What if you have a message on the subject, what would it be?
Invest in engaging people. So think that having people feeling that nature is their business, taking care of a piece of nature, could be the garden, the piece of common land in the city, like we had an example of parks right after the lockdown, which were given to, in an Italian city, given to association to take care of the park and give them the opportunity to perform some activities over there. So, I mean, this is something, again, quite local, but I think the point is to have people connected with nature and having people taking care of nature. And if they do it like with a small piece of land, that might become something that they also apply to the way to consume food, reduce the consumption of meat, getting more local food, choosing transportation systems that are more sustainable, and so on and so forth. So I would really start from the engagement of people in local green actions.
Thank you very much indeed. And Mauro?
Yeah, although I think the main lesson is that we cannot always foresee and prevent these diseases, but we can act to heal the relationship with nature, and this can reduce the risk of future pandemics. And so protecting the environment can make us more resilient in biodiversity. And let's really hope that that we learn the lesson. I think the other two key points, key conclusions. One of them is about this unprecedented opportunity with these recovery funds that need to be invested sustainably. They need to be invested in sustainable activities and conservation actions. If we don't do it now, we're never going to do it again. We've been talking about all these targets that are we keep missing. And finally, the promotion of this new deal for nature and people. So this global initiative that wants to sort of protect, restore natural habitats, safeguard the diversity of life, and reduce the footprint of consumption, and sort of the transition to more sustainable practices. These are the key things. I think they emerge from the conversation that we had today. So if we are all aligned, I think governments and people at the same time pushing for these targets, we can really make a difference, and achieve this transition that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Sharon, some final thoughts.
Thank you. I think I would echo what others have said. I mean, is this point that we're at this disjuncture, this crossroads right now, and we need to make sure that we do learn from what has happened. I think I think there's a massive role to play from the finance community alongside governments and the business community to be able to really plan ahead, and not just in thinking in terms of understanding and mitigating the negatives, but whilst also thinking about where are the opportunities for that positive investment. Restoration is something that will be really important moving forwards. Even going back to thinking about our food system, there's a lot of, we don't need to clear more land to grow food. There is degraded land that could be restored. We just need to be smart about it. We need to be using that land well, restoring that land back into production, and restoring natural ecosystems. So I think that's, and actually next year is the beginning of the UN decade on restoration. So we hope to see a lot more momentum in that space. So also thinking about that positive investment, which is happening but needs to be scaled up. And I think it is, in my mind, it's all about scale. As I've mentioned before, I think we know what needs to be done, but we just need it to happen across the board.
Thank you very much indeed to Sharon, Mauro, Joseph and Silvia. Thank you all very much indeed for your contribution. So I think we've learned quite a lot there. One of the things that really leapt out to me is that the reduction in biodiversity is something that people are becoming increasingly aware of, not just in context of climate change and the environment, but also from an economic and financial perspective. And I think Sharon highlighting some of that. Joseph talking about farming, and I think that we are really not necessarily seeing a conflict here. We are going in a direction that really aligns everything in a very optimal way. So thank you to all of our panelists, and Silvia has talked in a very illuminating way, as has Mauro too. And those pictures of Venice, I thought at the beginning, really demonstrate to us what point we are at and the realization really that we must come to over where this pandemic has come from and why it has come in the way that it has and what lessons we need to learn. So thank you very much indeed. I would like to thank our partners, Caritas and also the University of Luxembourg. And thank you from me as well to the European Investment Bank. I think it's a very strong connection here that we're seeing between finance, economics and also biodiversity. So that's very much underlined by the fact that this is hosted by the European Investment Bank. Thank you very much. And I'd like now to hand over to the Professor of Economics at the University of Luxembourg, just to give us her thoughts on what we've been hearing. And over to Conchita D'Ambrosio. Conchita, over to you.
I would like to start my concluding remarks thanking all of you who have contributed to make this event possible. Our speakers, our moderator, our online public. A special thanks goes to the interinstitutional team who worked all year long to the organization of these October Days. Luisa Ferreira at the European Investment Bank Institute, together with Luis Baptista, Matilde Del Valle, and Dalila Menzer, Anna Luisa Teixeira at Caritas Luxembourg, and Tiziana Tamborini with me at the University of Luxembourg. This is the 6th edition of the October Days. We are holding the October Days for Sustainable Development every year since 2015, year of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, to develop awareness, contribute to capacity building, and to disseminate knowledge on the Agenda 2030. I think we were successful with today's event to reach our aims. We had to adjust in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, like all of us, and we decided to dedicate this edition to the alarming decline in biological diversity for two main reasons. One is that 2020 was meant to be the year of crucial medium-term assessments of key indicators for the Agenda 2030 on biodiversity loss. And the second is a more specific reason, and here I'm quoting experts from, in particular, the UNESCO website. They write, the appearance of COVID-19 has shown that when we destroy biodiversity, we destroy the system that supports human life. The more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more difficult it is for a pathogen to spread rapidly or dominate. As I said, I'm quoting experts here, loss of biodiversity provides an opportunity for pathogens to pass between animals and people. And with our keynote speaker, we received at the October Days a positive signal from the Venice lagoon ecosystem, a strong signal of hope. We saw Venice during lockdown and an almost immediate response of the ecosystems where polluted water became clear and some animals came back to where they belonged before we pushed them away. As human beings have a strong impact on ecosystems, but the lagoon ecosystem had taught us that it is resilient and able to quickly respond to external changes. Let me discuss with you the term resilience and what this should imply for a socioeconomic system. The term resilience has been used and abused a lot. As Bonanno, one of the leading resilience researchers in psychology, puts it, with people giving to it so many different meanings. But the etymology of the term resilience has its root in the Latin verb resilire, meaning to jump back or to recall. And it is defined in the Merriam-Webster dictionary as the capability of a strained body to recover its size or shape after deformation caused especially by compressive stress, or an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. The first definition relates to the use of the term in material sciences, whereas the second describes it in relation to the social sciences. A resilient individual or a resilient ecosystem, once squeezed, is able to move towards the pre-event functioning level quickly. And the pandemic is definitely a shock for ecosystems and for socioeconomic systems. And psychologists have worked a lot on resilience, and this literature does not only consider going back to the pre-level event, but includes the possibility that post-recover functionality is improved. The term thriving is applied when the person is better off after overcoming adversity as compared to before the event occurred. And the latter phenomenon is also known as growth following adversity or post-traumatic growth, which can be attributed to newly developed individual skills and a psychological sense of mastering following the negative event. I hope that our socioeconomic systems are very resilient, that is, they recover quickly, but also that there will be growth following adversity, in the sense that we will all be better off than before. This is actually something that has happened after two big events that hit our world, the two world wars, with the introduction of two major improvements: universal suffrage, women were allowed to vote after World War I in many countries, and the introduction of the welfare states after World War II, again in many countries. And what could be the revolutionary improvements of our lives after COVID-19? An easy but more local improvement would be the introduction of a universal public healthcare system in the US beyond the already positive achievements of the Obamacare. Another step in this direction would be free vaccinations for all diseases for every citizen of the world, paid by the governments of rich countries. And there will be definitely changes in the world of work. Some of us have learned how to work from home with advantages and disadvantages of online meetings. And these new forms of work might lower the impact that humans have on ecosystems: less travel, less commuters, less tension on urban spaces. It could also boost robotization and automations of some productions. And I teach, and so many classes have been offered now online. This could mean that education could reach people all over the world that could not afford it otherwise. And as Minister Dieschbourg said, we need a shift to a well-being socioeconomic system with the Sustainable Development Works as a framework. And I really hope that this is the revolutionary improvement that we will see at the end of the pandemic. Thank you.
Conchita, thank you very much indeed. I just want to quickly go back to what Caroline is doing with the drawings. We can take that full frame, I suspect, and have a look at that. Biodiversity loss and pandemic emergency. Let's build a new reality together. Build it back better, as people have been saying in the UK. There's a fragility, as you can see. Our systems are fragile. Everything is connected. We've got the pandemic on the left-hand side there. Rethink our climate change, mass extinction, and relationship between us and nature. Have we understood this? So coming back to the scales that we were saying, social justice is the balance being struck there. And all connected to less heat, reconnect with nature, and of course fisheries. We were hearing about that a bit earlier, about how livestock is being threatened in our oceans. So that's given us, I think, a great deal to think about. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And it remains for me to thank once again the European Investment Bank and also Caritas and the University of Luxembourg. Thank you to all of you. I hope that we have emphasized the connection between a reduction in biodiversity, which has been not adequately addressed, I think is an understated way of putting it, and the health of our nations, our people, and also our economies. And I just wanted to say that we hope to see you next year for the 7th edition of the October Days for Sustainability. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Bye-bye and stay well.